Our Vice President, Mindy Reiser, will, in the end of the presentation, look at your questions and make up some of her own questions and ask Susan the questions. And first, Mindy will actually introduce the speaker for today. So Mindy, please take it over.
Okay, well, welcome, folks. We're delighted that you're taking the time to be with us. And we look forward to your comments and questions. As Jerry said, let's go to the chat. Okay, let me introduce Susan. Susan Pashman has numerous academic degrees. She holds a JD from Brooklyn Law School, a PhD in philosophy from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, an MA in philosophy from Columbia, and an MA in landscape history and design from the Inchbold School of Design in London, and a certificate in landscape history and design from Harvard. She also has extensive experience teaching and publishing articles in academic and other journals, as well as novels. And we should hear more about that at some point. Susan was born into a family of avid atheists, but has had a peek at Jewish observance from her Orthodox uncle, who showed her how to light Sabbath candles. And that memory lingered into her adulthood, and her interest in Judaism was rekindled when she moved from New York City to a mostly non-Jewish farming and fishing village on the east end of Long Island. Her early memories of Sabbath observance then led her into a quest for a Jewish identity, and at the age of 58, she studied Torah and she celebrated her bat mitzvah. And now we'll hear the rest of the saga from Susan. Unmute yourself, Susan.
I said, thank you, Mindy. It's wonderful to be here. The journey from an atheist home, I should mention that my grandfather, whose house I grew up in, was the manager of the Jewish Daily Forward, a socialist newspaper, and he was also the manager of their affiliated radio station, the station that spoke your language but did not particularly share your religion very much. And so it was this uncle who lived upstairs, and how he ever married into this family, I'll never know, because they used to give a great big noisy feast on Yom Kippur. And this was the son of a very Orthodox rabbi. He must have loved my aunt tremendously, is all I can say. But I did get to go upstairs from time to time, and he taught me the bracha, and I had no idea what the words meant. But those candles just stayed with me. And as you say, when I came to Sag Harbor on the east end of Long Island, and I found everybody turning to me for questions about Judaism, I was the Jew in the room all of a sudden, that may have spurred it. And also, I think it happens to a lot of people, feeling sort of alone. I needed to know more about this. What I really focused on, though, was not some broad history of Judaism, but just the Sabbath. I wanted to observe the Sabbath. I wanted to take a day of rest, who doesn't? But I also wanted to light the candles. And yet I had a feeling that it would be hypocritical of me if I didn't really test out what I was doing and ask myself if my feelings about this were authentic and sincere. And being a philosopher, I wanted it to make sense. I just wanted my Sabbath observance to make sense. And what finally happened was that I decided to take a year and observe the Sabbath every week and then think about it. And I took along for company on this year's journey all my friends, the philosophers of the Western world, whose systems of thought, whose viewpoints could be very enlightening in helping anybody make sense of something. And so what came out is this book, Journey to a Temple in Time, A Philosopher's Quest for the Sabbath. It is mostly philosophizing and mostly introducing readers to different philosophers from the Western canon, whose work and whose thought I utilized in trying to ask one question and then another and then another. But interspersed throughout the little diary of my weeks doing this are some short memoirs, in particular starting with the trip up the stairs to my uncle's apartment. Actually, I didn't always go up the stairs. I often insisted on being hoisted up in the dumbwaiter from the first floor of the building to the third floor where my uncle lived. And so stepping out of this dark, smelly place to light candles had an even more dramatic impact on me. What I've put together to try to make people get through this book quickly and get a sense of what's in it is a PowerPoint show. And Jerry's going to put that on, and so am I. And we are together going to go through the PowerPoint show. Let's see. Jerry, I'm having trouble seeing it. Do you have it up?
I'm trying to.
I can't get it. Ah, there it is. Okay, I have it.
Okay, good.
Okay, we're good. Okay, so this is a lovely photo I found for the cover of the book. I should mention, I'm very proud of the fact that this book was published in London by Valentine Mitchell. That is a Jewish press, and they were the first ever to take Anne Frank's diary and publish it as a book. So I'm very, very pleased to be published by them. Are we going to the next slide, Jerry? Thank you. Okay, well, you've already learned that this quest for the Sabbath began with candles, with blessings, and I came upon that experience many times before I sat down to write this book. I experienced Sabbath candle lighting at Girl Scout camp and in hotels in the Catskills where there was a day camp. My mother-in-law remarried and married an Orthodox man who had a real Shabbat every Friday night, to which I brought my children. So the love of Sabbath just deepened and deepened and deepened in me. We have another slide. Thank you. Being a philosopher, undertaking this set of questions about what I was really getting into if I were going to observe the Sabbath, and what made it meaningful and what made it something one ought to do. Ought is a big word for philosophers. I needed reasons. I needed very good reasons. Jerry, come on. Thank you. No, back. You're too far ahead. Jerry, I don't have.
Go ahead with this.
Okay, well, the previous slide, which we seem to have lost, was of Philo. And Philo lived just at the beginning of the Common Era. And I chose to talk to you a little bit about Philo because he was probably the first observant Jew who tried to convert Judaism into philosophy, or to use philosophy to make sense of Judaism. What he did was he took the philosophy of Aristotle, which was the most highly esteemed system of thought at the time. Philo lived in Alexandria, so he certainly had access to Aristotle because Alexander the Great was, there's Philo. Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle's and brought Aristotelian philosophy to Alexandria, which was then named for him. Philo spent his entire life rewriting the Torah as if it were an allegory, demonstrating Aristotle's philosophy. And when he was old and finally finished, he took his pages and pages and pages to Jerusalem to deliver them to the rabbis there. And the rabbis said, "Get out. We are not interested in Greek philosophy. We are not interested in rationalizing the Torah. The Torah tells us how we practice our religion. This is a religion to practice. It's not about thought." And poor Philo never got a reading. His work is now buried in some archive in, of all places, the Vatican. And now we can go on and look at the next picture of another Jew who was a little bit too rational for the Jews of his time, and that's Spinoza. Spinoza, as you may know, was also a mathematician and a physicist. And that's how I started in philosophy, as a physicist. And Spinoza also wanted everything to come out really rational in the end. And so he began by saying, look, you know, the reason there is so much superstition in the world is that people are not clear about very key words. And one of the key words in Torah is infinite. God is infinite, Spinoza said. Now, if God is infinite, you really need to understand what infinite means. Infinite means God is everywhere, and everything that exists is God. There cannot be anything that is outside of God if God is truly infinite. Think about it. That means Vladimir Putin is part of God, and you and I are part of God, and COVID is part of God, and the Nazis were part of God. And none of these things troubled the people of Spinoza's time, but there were plenty of horrible plagues and stuff. And the notion that everything is God had a name. It was called pantheism, and the Jews of his city considered that to be heresy. And he was put in cherem. And I have to tell you that every now and then I get emails from people all over Europe petitioning to forgive Spinoza and take him out of cherem and bring him back into the Jewish community. And I sign these because I think he was a brilliant philosopher. And I think he was right about the meaning of the word infinite and its implications. So having Philo in the background and Spinoza, I was wading into some pretty troubled waters trying to be a philosopher making sense philosophically of the practice of Sabbath keeping. And I was aware of this sort of troubled past, but philosophy is what I know, and I decided to use it. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. I had another philosopher that I was thinking about when I decided to do this, and that is really a very favorite philosopher, John Dewey, an American pragmatist. Dewey, for quite a while in his career before he came to Columbia to be head of the philosophy department there, ran the so-called lab school at the University of Chicago because he had a very stunning new philosophy of education. Dewey was totally opposed to rote learning and said the way students learn is by doing. Now, this book is a record of my doing because I decided to follow Dewey's suggestion, not suggestion, it was actually a dicta. And I decided that I would do my best to practice and observe the rules for keeping the Sabbath for a full year I would come home from synagogue on Saturday morning, having met with the congregation, but also having taken a class on the week's parsha. And I would spend the rest of the day mulling over what this business of Sabbath keeping was all about. Hi, Jerry, I need another slide. Can we have, okay. So the Sabbath is ordered or commanded as the fourth commandment, which means it's very important because the other commandments, as you know, have to do with God himself, have to do with don't steal, don't murder. Sabbath keeping is a really key practice in Judaism. It's not really there with kashrut. It's not there with observing Yom Kippur. It is a commandment, and that meant I had to pay very, very careful attention. So my first inquiry was, where did these commandments come from? Now, I suppose everybody knows that Moses went up on Mount Sinai, on the mountain. He came down with the tablets on which God had written the 10 Commandments, but everybody had gone seeking idol worship while he was away. And to punish them, he broke the tablets, ground them up in water, and made his people drink this horrible stuff. Then he went back up on the mountain and wrote down the commandments as he remembered them. So that's one source of the 10 Commandments. But can we have the next slide? Okay, there's another source, another story, which is that the 10 Commandments were passed along orally until the Babylonian exile, almost 600 years before Christ. And they were written down by scribes as the top people of the Jewish community in Israel were in exile in Babylon. And I wondered to myself if the meaning of the Sabbath might be different because of where this command came from. But then I realized that the people Moses was leading out of Egypt were a bunch of uncultivated ruffians who needed to be brought together into a solid community and who needed to be reminded and taught about their God. But similarly, the people in exile in Babylon were living in a community of hedonism and many glittering idols. And they too were likely to lose touch with each other and become part of the larger, very attractive community and lose interest in their God. So these two different situations were really the same in the sense that what was needed for the 10 Commandments were commands that would keep the community tightly woven together and keep the people in touch with their God. So we have 2 tablets and we have 2 purposes. And my obsessive compulsive personality is such that I decided it would be really nice if one tablet was there to serve one purpose and the other tablet was there to serve the other purpose. One tablet to meld the people into a tightly structured and close community, and the other tablet to teach those people about God. And I was looking for them to be 2 different tablets in that way. I started with the second tablet because, as you probably know, it has very familiar, very easy to understand commands on it. The commands on the second tablet, don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't say terrible things about your neighbor, are the basis of civil law throughout the world. And so every one of those commandments starts with lo, the Hebrew word for no. And basically they say, you probably want to commit adultery and murder and theft and libel. Just control yourself. No, you're not going to do this. And the final law, the 10th commandment, Jerry, is thou shalt not envy. Now, the other 4 on that second tablet talk about behavior. Don't do this, don't do that. But Jerry, we lost our thank you. But envy is a feeling, and the 10th commandment really says, don't feel this way. Don't have feelings of desire for things that don't belong to you. And I wondered, it's true that if people are filled with envy, eventually that envy is going to lead them to adultery or theft or murder. So it's really important to keep envy out of a society that you're trying to hold together. But it's a very odd commandment in that it's addressed to inner feelings. And I'm so curious about that 10th commandment that is the subject of my next book. But let's get back now, having looked at the second tablet, don't do this, don't do that, we get to the first tablet. And the first tablet's very important because that's where the 4th commandment, the one that I'm interested in, is situated. So the first tablet seems to go off in a different direction. The second tablet really was about holding the community together, keeping people's selfish impulses in check so that they could live together peaceably in a unified society. The first tablet starts off talking about God, just as I suspected it would. And it says, I'm the Lord thy God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's not a command. That's a hello. That's just, hi, that's who I am. I'm your new neighbor. You shall have no other gods beside me. Okay. Now, when I was in high school and I had to take the Regents, my Regents review book had a question, which was, what is the great gift of the Hebrews to Western civilization? And the answer was monotheism. And I've wondered a lot about that. I think that, this is an important commandment, but I don't think it is the real heart of Judaism. Because when you think about it, although the Egyptians had many, many gods, they had one chief CEO, and the rest of the gods were sort of like department heads who answered to the chief god. Similarly, the Greeks, similarly, the Romans, those chief gods had wives, but basically you had this hierarchy that was a pyramid, pardon the reference to the Egyptians. But I think this is for the same reason that when scientists find that they need a theory like Newton's laws to explain one set of phenomena, the way things move through space on Earth, and then they find another set of, they find those laws don't actually apply when they look to distant space, we resist saying, well, Newton's laws work on the Earth, and then we have this other set of laws for out there. What we want is what Einstein did. Einstein said, no, there's one single law, and Newton's laws are a subset of that. They are just particular cases of the larger set. So we're always looking for this one overarching principle that ties everything together. What I'm trying to say is that I think even in modern science, there is a human impulse for unity, for a single governing principle. And so monotheism was not just something the Jews gave to the world. I think that a lot of religions are tending toward a single unifying principle. Now, here's where Spinoza's insights come in, though, because if there is only one God with no departmental, vice presidents helping him, then that has to be the God of everything. That's not a CEO with department heads under him. A God of everything has to be everywhere. He has to be infinite, just as Spinoza said. So monotheism really implies an infinite God. Now, if I can get my next slide, we get to the second commandment. And this is one that is often given very short shrift, but I think it's really the heart of Judaism. Because if God is infinite, can you make an image of God? Can you draw an infinite picture? Can you build an infinite statue? What was wonderful about the Egyptian religions is if you wanted to have a conversation with God, you just had to go up to the temple, and there he was, made out of stone, standing on a pillar. And you could bring him apples and oranges and ask for favors. And in any case where you have a graven image of a god, or you could, when I was in China, people were bringing money, fake money, to give to statues of Buddha, and also bringing him oranges and apples. But if God is infinite, which is implied by monotheism, if God is infinite, then you can't make a picture of him. You don't even need a commandment to tell you not to. It's impossible to represent the infinite with your crayons or your clay. And it's also the fact that we can't even really form a concept of the infinite. So what we have for the Jews is a God that you can't touch, you can't see, you can't go and visit him to bring him gifts and ask for favors. There is no empirical evidence of him at all. So how can you even know that there's anyone there? What happens as a result of the second commandment, the commandment that tells you you cannot form a picture of God, you cannot name anything that describes God. This really is the commandment that directs you to take God on faith. Thank you. So you cannot go and argue with God. You can't bring him anything. You have to trust your life, the safety of your children, the future of your crops, the future of your house. You have to trust the entire future in your life to something you can't see or hear. And even though the prophets claim to hear God, you don't know whether you can trust them all the time. The second commandment is the commandment in which the Jews introduce the world to the notion of faith, believing in something that you have no physical evidence for. And I really think the second commandment is the key here. It's the really great gift that the Jews gave to the world. Now, if you cannot describe God, you can't say he's big, he's tall, he's short, he's skinny, he's hairy, he's bald. You can't say he's red or white or blue. You can't use any adjective. So what is God? A name. God is a name, and that is how we get to the third commandment. God is infinite, and there is only one. Because there is only one and he must be infinite, you cannot conceive of him, you cannot form an image of him. And that means all you have to hold on to is Hashem, the name, the name. That brings us to the third commandment, which says you mustn't take that name in vain. You don't use it to tell a lie or commit a fraud. Well, why? Because it's the only thing we have about God. And that's where we get the third commandment. So now we get to the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Well, my question now is, as I'm trying to learn more about Sabbath keeping and the fourth commandment, does this commandment belong on the first tablet that tells us all about God? Or does it belong really with the commands that are on the second tablet that tell you how to behave? On the face of it, the fourth commandment commands a certain behavior, that you remember and keep the Sabbath holy. Whatever that means, I'm going to get to that another slide from now. But if it's a command for Jews to do everything together on the Sabbath, like go to services or sit down and rest together, it could be that its real intent is to keep the community together, to build a stronger community. And so I had some time wondering if that's really the intent. If just going someplace with a whole bunch of other Jewish people to be part of a Jewish community is what the fourth commandment is really about. Because then I had to wonder, so what if we all go bowling together on Saturday? Or we all go to a matinee together on Saturday? Would that keep the Jewish community together? I thought, I wasn't really convinced. And besides, this fourth commandment is on the first tablet. Now, some people have said that the Sabbath keeps Jewish people apart from other people. And this notion of apartness is very, very important in the language of the fourth commandment. Is Sabbath keeping something that only the Jews do? My research into Sabbath keeping surprised me, because I found that all through the Mesopotamian neighborhood, there were all sorts of nations and tribes that kept a Shabbat, a day of rest. The Assyrians did. A number of the people that are mentioned in the Torah kept a Shabbat. Sometimes it was on a seventh day, sometimes it was twice a month, sometimes it was once a month, but the mythology surrounding it was always the same, that the people on earth made too much noise and the gods could never get enough rest. So they commanded the people to stop making noise and just stop doing everything for one day so that they could get some sleep. And the Assyrians particularly did this on the seventh day of each week. So Sabbath keeping is not something that just designates you as a Jew. So let's go on. Okay, the language of the fourth commandment. Okay, this is something I have to pay really careful attention to, because the language here was all really new to me. Number 4 says, remember, zachor. And my rabbi told our class one day that this remember is not make a note on your calendar so that when the seventh day comes, you know to observe it. He pointed out that what it really means is remember at all times that a day is coming when you are commanded to rest. And this notion of remembering carries all through Jewish practice. The fringes on the prayer shawl and fringes that Orthodox people wear all day, every day, are there so that you always remember that God is present. And the mezuzahs that we post on our doorposts are, again, to remind us of the instructions in Deuteronomy to post God's word on the doorposts. So this notion that remembering is not, put it in your calendar so you can call it up in 7 days. Remembering is something you're supposed to do all through the day, all day. Remember every day, all day, that there is a Sabbath that is coming. And what is it we're supposed to remember? We're supposed to remember to keep. That word is shamor, which we find in Shema. Pay attention. Remember to pay attention. Pay special attention to this fourth commandment so that you keep the seventh day kadosh. I was very lucky because my husband was schooled in a yeshiva for 10 years, and he happened to have the Concordance Bible, which allowed me to look up kadosh. Everybody in synagogue said kadosh meant sacred or meant holy, but I didn't really understand what I was supposed to do with sacred or holy. And what I found was that the root, kaf, dalet, shin, in kadosh, shows up in a number of words through the concordance. The concordance traces roots, so you can see every way that a particular root is used. This root shows up in the word Kaddish. And what is Kaddish? Kaddish is the prayer that is said to separate every single separate part of the service from the part before it. It signals the end of this section of the service, the beginning of another one. And we say Kaddish more often in the Sabbath service than in any other. Now, we also say Kaddish when we bury someone. And again, the notion is separation. We're separating the living from the dead. We're saying to the dead, you go. The living have to stay here and continue living. We're saying to the living, you need to go on with your lives. The person who has died is gone. So it is a separation, a very important separation between life and death. And another place where that root shows up is Kiddushin, the part of a wedding ceremony where the groom takes his bride from her family and brings her into his, separates her from her family, and also separates her from the other women who happen to be lolling around looking to meet somebody. She is now mine. She has been taken away from the crowd and she is not available to you. So the word kadosh really signifies to separate. So what we have for the fourth commandment is remember at all times to pay attention to this day that comes at the end of your work week, to make it separate from everything else. Now, this is where I ran into a lot of trouble, because the way to keep it separate, according to the rabbis, is to observe the 39 forbidden activities, the melachot. And you can look this up on Google and you will find some very strange things there. It's often said that the 39 forbidden activities really are activities that had to do with building the temple or with creating the Ark of the Covenant. Gee, I locked up my dog, but now my birds are making noise. I hope they're not bothering you. So you find things in the melachot like building a fire, digging a hole, things like that. But there are other things in the melachot, other strange forbidden acts, like taking more than 2 stitches. You can take 1, but not more. Writing more than 1 letter of the alphabet, but you can write 1. And when I asked a rabbi friend about this, he said, well, if your prayer shawl tears, or if some other important garment tears, you can fix it with 1 stitch, just enough to hold it together, but you have to wait till the end of the day if you really want to repair it. And the same thing with letters. If you find a letter in the Torah scroll that you're reading that is misshapen, you can correct 1, but no more than that. And this is just for emergencies. The other stuff in the melachot is you mustn't take the bones out of a fish on Shabbat. You mustn't take a pit out of an olive on Shabbat. Why? Why? Well, because it's work. It's work, and you're supposed to cease from work. And so a good Jewish housewife will remove all the bones from the fish she wants to use as the first course of her Shabbat dinner. And then the fish is, of course, a mess. So she chops it up with some onion and some matzah meal, and she makes gefilte fish. And that's why you have gefilte fish on Shabbat, because you don't have to take the bones out of it. What about this taking the pit out of the olive? You can't take the pit out of the olive, but you can suck the olive off the pit. Yes, that's because taking the olive is pleasurable. Digging out the pit is work. You can see how this sort of do this, but don't do that was not really something I found I could pay close attention to. And so I decided halfway through my quest that I was not going to be able to solve this problem myself, that I was going to have to talk to the rabbi. And I was worried because I've talked to rabbis and I know the answers. The answers are usually, well, on the one hand, this, but on the other hand, that. And according to Rabbi so-and-so, he would say this, but Rabbi, the other guy would say something else. But that's not what my rabbi said. My rabbi said, here's a book. And if you will take this book, can I have my next slide, please? If you will take this book by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and read it, I think you will come to some resolution of all of these problems that are troubling you. What was beautiful about Rabbi Heschel's book was that he calls the Sabbath a temple in time. And he says that because, no, I need that previous page, Jerry, thank you. God, of course, does not exist physically in the physical world, so he doesn't take up space. Now, there are plenty of things that don't take up space that do exist, like, for example, my thoughts, but they exist in time. So if something exists and doesn't exist in space, the only thing left is time. And Heschel's view is that because God exists only in time, we must not build a temple in space. We must not build a temple of bricks and mortar, of stones or wood. We have to build a temple in time, which means set aside a holy time for God, a kadosh time, a special, separate time to be with God. Now, I had maintained a considerable skepticism about whether God existed. And here is Heschel saying that what the Sabbath is for is to spend time with God. And so I had to wonder how I was going to be able to do that. Okay, so let's look at this next one. What I decided I had to do was ask myself if there's some aspect to me that only exists in time. And immediately it was clear. I am both a body and a mind. I am both a physical object and a consciousness. My consciousness does not exist in space. You can pick my brain apart as much as you want. You will never find what I'm conscious of. You'll have to ask me what I'm thinking. You'll never see what I'm thinking. You might find the molecule in my brain that correlates with what I'm thinking, but you'll never know what my thought is unless you ask me. So I have this consciousness, or what earlier philosophers would call a soul. Now, generally, people who believe in the soul also believe in God, but I decided to set that big question aside and conclude that there is some aspect to me that is not existing in space. It's a very important part of me. It's the most important part of me. I know it exists. It exists only in time. And therefore, I am in some respects like God. And I think that's what Heschel is suggesting is my key to observing the Sabbath. So we get back to the fourth commandment. Set aside a separate day each week to be with God, to actualize that part of yourself or that within you, which is godlike. Now, if I were Orthodox, I wouldn't have to ask, why should I do that? Because as an Orthodox person, it's God's command and I have to follow it. But I'm a free-thinking philosophy person, and I need a better reason. I'm still looking for the reason. I understand more what is involved in observing the Sabbath. I must set aside time to live my godlike self. But what does it mean to say, I must do this, I should do this, it's the moral thing to do? Well, I considered Aristotle again. Aristotle, the Greeks generally, had a notion of what ought to be done. Man, they said, is a rational animal, and so man has the potential to be supremely reasonable. And because you have that potential, you must actualize it. Just as an acorn must actualize its potential to become an oak tree, a person must actualize their full potential. So Aristotle would have said, Susan, you have to observe the Sabbath because you have a potential to be godlike, and you can't just let that potential go to waste. You have to actualize it. Well, that gave me, a little bit of encouragement for this, but there are some other ways of looking at the question of what we ought to do. One very good reason to keep the Sabbath, and in fact, when I taught this book as a course at a synagogue, I had a lapsed Catholic Italian man there who was very portly and who said that in spite of the way he was raised, he had decided to observe a Sabbath because his doctor told him he had very high blood pressure. And he decided if he took one day a week to rest, it would be good for his health. And I said, you don't really need the Sabbath for that. Just take a day and rest and get your blood pressure down. But this is an example of what the great moral philosopher Kant would have called prudence. If you want to get your health to improve, then you should take a day off. But what if I don't care about my health? Well, then this isn't binding on me. It's an imperative, but it's only in the form of if-then. Kant said the moral imperative is really categorical. There's no if-then about it. It's just you must do it. And the moral imperative for Kant is contained in the notion of duty. It's what we must do regardless of what our personal objectives are, whether we want to lose weight or drop our blood pressure down or be nice, whatever it is that we want to do has nothing to do with it. A categorical imperative, an ought, is what everyone must do because it is one's duty. Now, how do you know your duty? You ask yourself, what is the highest self I am? And it turns out for Kant and for all the philosophers of his period, it's reason. You have to act as reason dictates. Why? Because reason is the same in all people. Reason is what gives us Euclid's geometry. Reason is what gives us Aristotle's logic. And reason dictates that you are no different from anyone else who is rational. So to find out what your duty is in any given situation, Kant says, you just ask yourself, is this act I'm about to do something that I should generalize to all people? Which means, of course, that other people will treat me as I'm contemplating treating someone else. The reasonable, rational thing to do, Kant says, is the moral imperative. Well, Jews are not particularly interested, as Spinoza found out and as Philo found out, in general universal principles. We're much more interested in what we as a particular people are supposed to do. So I didn't think that Kant's moral imperative was going to help me very much in answering why I should keep the Sabbath. But Spinoza, actually, strangely enough, gave me an idea here. And that is the answer to the question, how can I be godlike and why should I be godlike? Comes from Spinoza's view that God sees all of history and all of the universe in a single glance. And that is because God is the most objective knower. He knows everything in the sense of what caused what. He sees the physical world as a string of causes. He sees the world of ideas as a string of logically connected ideas. And he sees it all in one moment. Why? Because he can step way, way back and be perfectly objective. And I decided that one interpretation of this is the Sabbath can be seen as a day when we must step back from our personal concerns, from our personal business, from our worries about our own family and our own fortunes, and step far enough back so that we see the world from as great a distance as we possibly can. May I have the next slide, please? So, if my soul or my mind, my reason is what makes me godlike, I enter the temple in time, keeping the Sabbath, by feeling myself only as a soul, only as, in a sense, disembodied, so that I see the world in a single moment of insight. So I see other people as being just as big or just as small as I am. I see their pain as being just as important as my pain. I see their hopes and dreams as being just as important as my dreams. And if you can maintain that distance from your own personal mishigas for a day, you won't just lower your blood pressure. You will also have a godlike day. You'll be able to say, I've just spent a day in the temple in time. Now, I was very troubled, if I could have another slide, please. I was very troubled toward the end of my, you can move ahead there, Jerry. We've already done this. I was very troubled as I was getting to the end of my year of observing the Sabbath, because just toward the end, we get into the book of Deuteronomy. And that's where Moses sits down with his people and says, this is what we've been through in the past 40 years. And I want you to remember that God takes care of us when we keep his commandments, and he doesn't take care of us if we don't. And you're going into this land, and he gives them a lot of instructions. But one of the things he does in this so-called Song of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy is that he recites the 10 Commandments again. So the 10 Commandments appear twice in the Torah, once in the book of Exodus and once in the book of Deuteronomy. Commandments 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all identical in both of the tellings. But in Deuteronomy, the fourth commandment, my commandment, the one I've spent the whole year trying to understand, says something different. In Exodus, it says, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, because I created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day I rested. So you must rest too. You and your servants and your pets and all your farm animals. Everything comes to a halt on that 7th day, because that's the day I rested. Now in Deuteronomy, it says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, because I'm the God who took you out of the land of Egypt. Wait a minute, isn't that Passover? Why is that the fourth commandment? Why is that the reason God gives for us to keep the Sabbath? Well, of course, freedom is probably the highest Jewish value, and that is why we recite the Haggadah at Passover, to remember how much we treasure freedom. So I had to put on my philosophy cap once again, just when I thought I was finally there, and realize that, yes, physical objects obey the laws of physics, Newton's apples fall from the tree at 32 feet per second square, and my body will fall from a tree at 32 feet per second square. But unlike an apple, I also have a soul. And that means that in many cases, unlike an apple, I'm free to choose what I'm going to do. And if Sabbath keeping is connected to freedom, the way it is in the book of Deuteronomy, then I'm interpreting that as Sabbath observance is something I am free to choose. So I got my way out of the commandment itself, and I'm not doing it just because I've been told to. I'm doing it because I understand what's involved now, and I'm choosing authentically to do it. Yes, that is Peter Pan. And if we do we have a few moments, because I did at the end of this book get back to this whole issue of whether I could believe in God, and this whole question of the first, second, and third commandments, saying, you know, God is not something you're ever going to see empirically. You're not going to find physical evidence of God. And so, yeah, it's a question of faith. It's a free choice of faith. Let's go back to Peter Pan for a minute, though, if we could, because Peter Pan, if any of you saw the musical, you know that Peter Pan manages to get the children and so on. And then he notices that his sidekick, Tinkerbell, here at the bottom of the picture, who is living in a jar, gives off a beautiful light. But at one point in the musical, Peter notices that the light is flickering. And he says, oh my goodness, Tinkerbell's light is going to go out. That means that Tinkerbell is dying. Oh, we don't want Tinkerbell to die, but Tinkerbell is sick and sad because she thinks that people don't believe in fairies. We have to keep Tinkerbell alive. Everybody, please clap if you believe in fairies. Let's show Tinkerbell we believe in fairies. And everybody in the audience claps. Now, I clapped when I saw it. I wanted Tinkerbell to live. I don't believe that fairies exist, but that's not what we were being asked. We were asked not to believe that fairies exist, but to make a decision to act in a particular way. Make a decision, in this case, to clap, to keep Tinkerbell alive. And I think that in a case, this is an argument that comes out of another great American pragmatist, William James. James said, look, you know, you're not going to find evidence that God exists in the empirical world. You're just going to have to make a decision without the evidence. You're going to have to make a decision about how you want to live your life, what you want to do. So the question of whether you're going to keep the Sabbath, the question of whether you're going to act as if this command came from God, is a free choice for you to make. There's no other way to decide this. You're going to decide to keep the Sabbath or not. And it's based on faith. It's believing in, which is different from believing that. So people who are sitting around waiting for the evidence that God exists are waiting for something they know they're never going to get. It really does come back to the second commandment, the commandment that you really, when it comes to God, it's not a question of evidence, it's a question of faith. And for me, whether or not to keep the Sabbath is a choice to make, a choice about whether you want to spend a day feeling divine and feeling that you are in spiritual contact with that within you that is godlike. That's a decision that you make without waiting for evidence. And I guess that's basically the content of this book, although I should tell you that at some point I also called upon Sartre and Nietzsche, and you'll have to read the book to find out about how that was worked in. I had told Jerry that if we had time, I would read you one of the short memoir sections of the book, the way I started keeping the Sabbath was in fact entirely hypocritical and entirely based on lying to myself and to others. I don't know if we have that time, do we? Jerry, do we have time for a reading, or should we just take questions?
Well, we have about 20 minutes, well, about 23 minutes left, so.
Okay, I will read you a short memoir piece. Excuse me?
No, go ahead.
Yes, that appeared in the foreword, not because of my grandfather, he was long dead. So the title of this is My Great Big Sabbath Lie. It is 4 p.m. on a September Friday, and I have just completed my first week of work at one of New York's august law firms, the kind that prides itself on keeping its junior lawyers toiling into the wee hours and all through the weekend. Yet here I am heading home to Brooklyn to spend the weekend with my 2 sons. I was thrilled to be offered this job. For a single mother raising 2 young boys and 2 dogs, my law school success was considered miraculous, and my job at a prestigious firm is expected to continue that trajectory. But in law school, I could keep my own time card. Now I serve a bevy of partners who, in fond remembrance of their own early years in the law, happily continue a custom of 90-hour work weeks. I've left my calling as a professor of philosophy, a profession I loved, for a career that offers a better means to provide for my children. But will this boost to the domestic coffers cost me precious time as a parent? I'm plagued by the suspicion that my shiny new career may prove a terrible mistake. I worry day and night that I'm actually abandoning my primary responsibility. Ever since my husband and I separated, I had stuck firmly to our tradition of family dinners. Coming together at the end of each day to share the day's stories over a meal is, I had always believed, the secret ingredient in emotionally healthy children, all the more so when other family bonds have been tested and damaged, as they are in divorce. I explained my philosophy of child rearing to my employers when I was hired, and swore that taking work home at supper time would not diminish the quality of what I could produce. They smiled knowingly. This woman will soon learn that the pay at plush law firms demands domestic sacrifice. I was not the first woman who believed she could change the system. On my first assignment, I'm teamed with another new associate named Saul, a Sephardic Jew who lives in Flatbush and is, like most new associates, much younger than I am. He lives with his parents and he banks his paychecks while saving for an apartment of his own. At Friday's lunch, he remarks that he's informed our supervising partner of his intent to leave early to reach home in time for the Sabbath. So, Saul will leave early every Friday, earlier and earlier as the days get shorter. So then Saul will not be in on Saturdays, and he won't be in on Sundays either because weekend assignments are a package deal. Saul will never have to work on weekends. Suddenly, the way out of my conflict becomes clear. As my train rumbles toward Wall Street, I find myself exultant and sorrowful all at once. The unthinkable fact is that a mere 1 week into my new career, I have lied to my employer. Not only that, I have told the worst of all possible lies. At Wall Street, I change to the express train. In just minutes, I'll arrive in Brooklyn. My sense of triumph at having pulled off a marvelous coup has dissolved completely into profound remorse. I have lied about my relationship with God. I'm not religious, have never observed the Sabbath at home. My elder son, Zach, reluctantly celebrated a bar mitzvah at his grandmother's insistence. My younger boy, Ben, aware that his brother garnered mucho loot for his troubles, has more willingly embarked on that project. There's no question that I've been lax in teaching my children the Jewish rituals, and now it seems I've traded my guilt about caring properly for my kids for a new and surprising variety of that same emotion. I emerge from the subway, a black tangle of bad feelings tightening about my brow like an ill-fitting hat. I really don't regret having lied to a century-old New York law firm. They should accommodate their former practices to the needs of women attorneys. It is the particular lie itself that feels so terribly wrong. In a fog of self-reproach, I drift into the little bakery on Henry Street and ask for a challah and also a fruit pie. Very nice, the smiling bakery lady says as she coils red and white string around the pie box. Shabbat shalom. Still in a melancholic cloud, I enter the liquor store and ask the baffled owner for a bottle of kosher wine. He knows my preferences in reds and whites. What do I want with this sweet stuff that's not even good for cooking? Guests, I say, and I want to bite this new lie right off my tongue. Finally, it's down the steps to the Variety Mart where turpentine and floor wax mingle their odors. A box of white candles, I say to the Cuban owner, the ones for Friday nights? Oh, sure, I know those, she says. At home, Lorraine, the woman I employ as a mother's helper, is startled by my early arrival and plainly confused when I announce that we will be preparing a Shabbat dinner like those I attend with my boys at grandma's. We'll need an ironed linen tablecloth and napkins and fruit or soup before the main course, I tell her, and we'll roast a chicken. I'm going to show you how. When my firstborn arrives home, he demands to know what's going on. Hypocrite, he says, you're just doing this because, never mind, I say, I will be home with you every weekend. It's worth it. You don't have to live the lie that you told, you know. He's always been that kind of child. His younger brother is enchanted by the preparations, especially by the yellow braided bread and the bakery shop dessert. And there's a starter I've devised for the occasion, a plate of sliced apple, orange, grapefruit, and kiwi bathed in Cointreau. Not a traditional Shabbat dish, just something I've dreamed up to mark the specialness of this meal. Lorraine beams as we gather around the table and I light and bless the candles. The boys join in, blessing first the wine, then the challah. Before we start our meal, I say, I promise you, what weekdays bring, I will always be home for dinner on Friday nights, and I will always be here for you on the weekends. This is my covenant with you, I tell them. I will be here for Shabbat, and so will you. Zach, who is beginning to notice girls, frowns at this last part. But that's the way God made his covenant with Israel. It wasn't a contract agreed to by two equal parties. God said what he would do and then told the people what they would do in return. He just laid it down for them. You can invite your friends to join us, I tell Zach. There'll always be room at the table, but you will be here every Friday night for dinner, no matter what else you have to do afterward. Well, this seems okay. Zach may want to be out with his friends in the evening, but he's not yet ready to take a girl to dinner. Ben finds the whole idea ingenious. He's already compiling a list of invitees. The freshly laundered linen, the glowing candles, the saffron-scented bread and wine all make our Friday supper time an evening apart from the others. My children arrive at the table clean and radiant, and in later years, they even shave for the event. They unfold their linen napkins in their laps. The conversation is more civil than usual. No one starts a fight. Word spreads in our building about the candlelit dinners in our apartment, and invitations are sought. Children of all backgrounds learn to say Shabbat, and a few try to learn the blessings. Occasionally, there's some griping about a basketball game or a birthday party that will conflict. And I say, I'm sorry, but this is the way we do it here. It's my covenant with you. Over the months and years, Shabbat acquires a powerful presence in our home, sustaining our tiny family through the years that I labor at the law. And when I interview for a new job, My Sabbath observance is one of the first things I mention to the prospective employers, and most of them are charmed by my, quote, good family values. Zach leaves for college, and Ben invites more friends to join us. I invite friends of my own. Our table is always bountiful, and seats are in demand. The lie I told to my first employer turns out to be one of the best mother things I've ever done. When Ben leaves for college, it's time for Lorraine to move on. Alone with our beagle, I'm tempted to stop cooking and explore the world of takeout. I struggle with this and then decide I must continue the tradition of the Sabbath. I invite friends each week. I light candles and bless them. I bless the wine and the bread. My guests open their soft linen napkins in their laps. This is perhaps a way for a single woman to behave when others all over the city are gathering in pubs to share a drink at the end of the work week. As Ahad Ha'am said, more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. Shabbat dinner outlived its usefulness as the ritual that kept my family intact and shifted to being something else, a transfer point from the frenetic world of international banking to a world of reflective inwardness and peace.
Wow, what a phenomenal way to conclude your formal remarks, Susan.
Well, there's both in this book. There are these memoirs, and then there's the philosophical reasoning. It goes back and forth.
Okay, we have a little bit of time. There are not too many questions there. If you have any, you should hurry and write them. There is an interesting one about a work by someone called Rachel Kaddish on the weight of ink, where she corresponds with Spinoza. Are you at all aware of this reference?
Rachel Kaddish? I know a Rachel Kalish.
Am I pronouncing it right? No, it's K-A-D-I-S-H. Okay, well, that's something to explore. Where are you now in terms of your Friday night and Shabbat observance?
Well, I have set aside 24-hour period when the local Chabad invites people for dinner. We go there to start our Shabbat dinner. But if at home, we light candles, and I turn off all the electronics. No email, no telephone. You cannot reach me. And people know that. People know that if you write to me too late in the day, Friday, you won't hear from me until Sunday. And it works just fine. Frankly, I've never owned a cell phone anyway. So
good.
I don't miss it. I don't miss it. A lot of my friends are furious that they can't call on the way to an appointment to tell me they're going to be late. And my answer to that is, yeah, well, so don't be late when you're dealing with me. So I don't have a problem with turning off the cell phone, and I just don't pick up the phone. The phone takes messages and my email waits for me. But I also don't, do chores in the garden, which is one of my most important hobbies. And I don't work. I don't turn over the earth. I don't take 2 stitches, and I don't bone the fish or pull the pit out of the olive. As a philosopher, I'm doing a lot of what I do the rest of the week. And this is actually one of the questions that I raise in the book. I didn't want to go into it here. It's a little subtle, but I have a friend who's a poet. And when I was telling her all about what I'm working on, she said, well, so can I think up a poem on Shabbat if I don't write it down? And I said, I'm having the same problem. Can I really think up some solution to a philosophical problem? Because that's actually my work. It's what I do as a philosopher, and it's what she does as a poet. And maybe I'm just fortunate that a lot of my work is simply sitting and contemplating. So I'm not uncomfortable spending a day thinking through a problem. But I know, for example, my Italian student who wanted to just sit still for a day on Saturday said he was going crazy trying to sit still. I take walks. I live by the sea, so I can walk on the beach. I can walk through the forest. I don't have a problem filling the day with interesting things. I read, and when Shabbat is over and we get to Havdalah, and I think about the week ahead, all I can think of is, well, I feel restored. I feel that I have stored up the spiritual energy to go back into the world and tackle it anew.
Okay, your search has certainly taken you in some interesting directions in terms of overall Jewish life.
Yes.
And biblical searches too, in terms of the meaning and the ordering of traditions. How has your search on the Shabbat influenced your relationship to other Jewish commandments? We talk about 613.
Ah, well. Yeah, that's very tricky because, as you're probably aware, each of the 613 is supposed to fall under the category of one or the other of the 10 commandments, right? The 10 or 10 categories and everything else. I'm really not somebody who can be held to doing things I think are silly, which is why the olive and the pit became just an impossible stopping point for me. And, I do have a lot of contact with our local Chabad, and I love what they do. I love the way they have brought so many kids on college campuses into a Jewish setting that's welcoming and peaceful. And they are growing faster than just about any other Jewish, but I cannot worry myself about what I consider trivia. The 613 commands or mitzvot, many of them I see as really important and worthwhile. And the ones that seem to me to be picking bones out of fish, I really have to ignore. I think that what's important about those 613 is what's important about the fringe on your clothing or the mezuzah. It's about remembering in everything that you do that the world is not entirely made up of material objects, that the world has a spiritual component, and that we as souls share in that component. And that is what keeps getting lost in this huge rush for consumer goods and bargains and Black Fridays and all that other stuff. It's really important, I think, to detach from that. And what a lot of those 613 mitzvot are about is maintaining a spiritual life, really. Just keeping
we have time for, I think, one more question, and then Jerry would have some closing remarks. Another Susan Barokas asks, how does synagogue or community worship fit into your Shabbat, or does it?
Well, it does. And actually the chapters that I didn't go into, where I talk about Nietzsche, of all people, have to do with not just exercising that part of your spirit that you feel is divine, spending that day with God, but feeling divine. And when I asked myself, what is the feeling? The feeling, I think, is in music. The feeling I first felt when I went to my first Pete Seeger Thanksgiving Day concert in Carnegie Hall, and the walls just shook with music, and we just all rose up feeling like we were one body. And when I'm what synagogue provides for me on Saturday that I think is the most important thing it provides is that uplift that one gets from participating in the musical aspects. It moves us emotionally. And I've been talking about Kant and Spinoza, and one might get the idea that keeping the Sabbath is a highly intellectual matter, but it is also a matter of feeling, and that's where the music comes in.
So you go to Chabad.
I've gone to a number of different synagogues, and what I love about Chabad, even though women have to sit somewhere else and we're not always acknowledged as much, what I love about Chabad is the fervor of their music and the stamping of feet and clapping of hands and the emotional input that they give to the Sabbath. But I must say the other thing I really like about it is that there's no board of directors. There's no administration. There's none of that politics that I found drove me so crazy at other synagogues. And I'm willing to put up with being a mere woman to get away from the politics that I found at other synagogues. You know, I was not taken to synagogue as a child. That my grandfather had 15 grandchildren, and he had to be dragged into the bar mitzvahs by my grandmother. He never attended the bar mitzvahs of his own 3 sons. He was that much of a non-believer. And my father was very much like him. So my first experience as being a member of a synagogue came when I was 57 years old and decided to prepare for a bat mitzvah.
Okay, very good. Well, look, I want to encourage people to learn more and rejoice with Susan. You've heard some of her writing, and it's extremely moving, and I'm sure more of it is in store. This is the book.
Yes, and it's on Amazon.
Okay, and probably in your local independent bookstore, they can always order it if you want to go that route. And you're working on a new book, Susan?
Well, one book that's in the pipeline that I'm no longer working on is my dissertation, which is a book of philosophy. But the book that I am starting up now and have collected a lot of notes for is on the 10th commandment, on envy, and why it's on the second tablet, designed to keep the community knit closely together and living in peace. And I have a lot of philosophical material in that book as well.
That should be fascinating. And what
I have a great title for it.
All right.
It's called Lust in the Heart. Jimmy Carter's word for envy, lust in the heart.
What was your dissertation topic?
My dissertation topic was landscape aesthetics. It was about the kinesthetic basis of expressive art, particularly in landscape, but it went across to all the arts, and it's about neuroscience, really. Kinesthesia as the basis of emotion and movement as the basis of our feeling when we walk through a landscape.
Wow, lots to
I'll let you know when they finally find a publisher.
All right, we'll try to organize the talk. Jerry, why don't we go to you? Susan, thank you so much to think about, and extremely rich, and some of us may return to Kant and Spinoza and Philo and Aristotle and Plato, thanks to you.
I'm happy to be of service. Never have too many people reading philosophy.
It's interesting having someone with a PhD in philosophy and a master's in landscape design. So that's, that's
you know, when I was in graduate school, I started a dissertation on film aesthetics because I was trying to understand how the movement of a camera toward the subject creates an emotional quality. And the science didn't exist at that time. I found the science in the library at MIT when I was studying landscape theory at Harvard. And I applied it to movement through the landscape. But there was a gap of like half a century between when I started and when I finally got to write down what I wanted to say.
It's so interesting and how you can combine Hasidim with President Carter. It's also so I do recommend people buy the book. As you see, Susan is a very, besides being intellectual and joyful, etc., she's a very good writer. So I'm sure you enjoyed the book. I certainly did.